Amen. Well, I would love to share with you this story from the book of Acts. We're continuing on in this series we've been in the book of Acts. And my hope is that these words come alive for us this morning and that we connect deeply to this story and that we can find our place in this story today. I want to remind you of the predominant theme in the book of Acts. It is God's joining of Jews and Gentiles. It is a joining, a bringing together of different people to find unity in their love and commitment to Jesus. Acts is the story of God's passionate love for all of His creation, His deep longing for communion with those outside the chosen people of Israel. And you see it in the way the Spirit works. The Spirit is just driving people to these folks who were considered outsiders because God desperately wants them to be part of His family. We have discovered in Acts already that God takes great pleasure in bringing people together, particularly people who would prefer to stay apart. The Spirit is an expression of God's deep and passionate love for all people. And that is why the Spirit is repeatedly leading people to break down boundaries and bring people together. The early church began as a small, marginal group of Jews who loved Jesus. All right, y'all need to remember that. That's how the early church started. It was a bunch of Jewish people, a small group who loved Jesus. They believed He was their Messiah, their Lord, and their Master. These folks still went to the local synagogues daily. They kept the law. They followed the dietary restrictions. Most of them likely kept distance from Gentiles, seeking to protect their identity and faith from this dominant Greco-Roman culture around them. They were very fearful of losing their faith and their identity. We're 11 chapters into Acts, and the church is still almost exclusively Jewish people. We have seen some glimpses of change and openness. You remember the story of Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch. Certainly Peter's encounter with Cornelius that we talked about last week, this Gentile family. He went into their home. They all received the Spirit. But change was happening very slowly. This mission God had to bring these two groups together was not happening quickly. And it was taking a while for this early group of Christians to kind of catch on God's vision that the Gentiles were supposed to be part of it. You know, the early Jewish Christians mainly were reaching out to their own people, probably because they didn't understand maybe God's desire to bring in the Gentiles. Maybe they didn't feel comfortable with the outsiders and they didn't want to reach out to them. But Acts is about the reach and the embrace growing wider and wider and wider. It's about that circle of God's family just getting wider and wider and wider, including more and more people. But it wasn't something that happened easily or very quickly. Our text for today picks up from where we left off last week. Peter had gone to Jerusalem to explain this dramatic thing that had happened in Caesarea with Cornelius and his family. He had to go explain it to the Jerusalem leaders because they weren't quite ready for this move of the Spirit, which we're often not, right? We're often not ready for the move of the Spirit, so that shouldn't be surprising. But the Spirit had moved, brought these Gentiles into the family, and Peter had some explaining to do, why he spent that time in that Gentile home. Peter was trying to explain it the best he could. And then we come to our text for today, the first verse. Now, those who had been scattered by the persecution that broke out when Stephen was killed traveled as far as Phoenicia and Cyprus and Antioch, spreading the word only among Jews. So if y'all remember the story of Stephen, Stephen was the first person on record that was killed for his commitment to Jesus. And so he was killed. It wasn't like a state-sanctioned execution. This was a public lynching. These people stoned him in public and killed him. And after that, which often happens, this is some of the fear we have now. When something violent like that happens, it increases the violence, right? And so a lot of people who had some fear about these early Christians ended up responding in more violence and started targeting the Christians. And so they had to flee, and they left Jerusalem I think most of us would do the same, right? We would get out of here if we knew our lives were in danger. And so they fled around to other places because they were worried their lives were in danger. They went to as far as Phoenicia, Cyprus, Antioch. Y'all may not know where these places are, but they're a good bit away from Jerusalem. Because of this, the church actually grew because as these people moved to other places, they still shared Jesus with folks where they went to these other spots. But you will notice the text says that they only shared the gospel with the Jews. They still weren't reaching out to Gentiles and inviting them in to this new family of Jesus followers. Next verses say, some of them, however, men from Cyprus and Cyrene, went to Antioch and began to speak to Greeks or Gentiles also, telling them the good news about the Lord Jesus. The Lord's hand was with them, and a great number of people believed and turned to the Lord. So most of the people who left Jerusalem because of the persecution reached out to only Jews, but it says some men from Cyprus and Cyrene decided to try something new. In a sense, they broke rank. They crossed boundaries. They reached out to Gentiles in Antioch, telling them the good news about Jesus. It doesn't appear they asked permission from the Jerusalem leaders to do this. They felt led and inspired to cross this boundary, to do something different, to take a risk, and invite Gentiles to join their new family they found in Jesus. As we're reading through the story, this may not sound like a big deal, but this was a really big deal. We don't know the names of these men from Cyprus and Cyrene, but I have great respect for these folks. These seem to me to be rebellious followers of Jesus. We need more people like them who are willing to break rank, who are willing to go against the grain and upset the status quo for the purpose of sharing the good news of Jesus and His kingdom with more and more and more people. I imagine other Christians at the time, some of these Jewish Christians felt like, well, maybe we should invite these Gentile neighbors to come to our dinner, or maybe we should reach out to them because Jesus kind of did that kind of stuff. But maybe they thought, well, maybe I shouldn't do it because, my peers might not like that. Maybe I'll get reprimanded by the leadership. Maybe I'll get in trouble for doing this. Maybe I'll get in trouble at my work if I start to act this way. But in my mind, I thank God for these unnamed men who had the courage to move in a new direction, even if most of the church wasn't ready for it yet. In Acts, next verse, news of this reached the church in Jerusalem, and they sent Barnabas to Antioch. Now, this verse doesn't say a lot, but it really does say a lot. First off, clearly what they were doing was a big deal because it reached Jerusalem. The news of what was happening reached Jerusalem. Jerusalem was about 300 miles south of Antioch. They didn't have internet back then. They didn't have cars. They didn't have buses. To travel 300 miles is a long way. That would take a long time. But news of what was happening in Antioch got back to the leaders in Jerusalem. It would take time for this to happen. But eventually they found out what was going on in Antioch. They likely heard stories of these creative, maybe even rebellious Christians who were trying something bold and new and innovative. They were reaching out to the people that others didn't want to reach out to, inviting the Gentiles into their communities. Have you heard about what's happening in Antioch? They have started house churches with Gentiles. They're sharing table fellowship with Gentiles. And they aren't even requiring them to be circumcised and obey the Jewish laws. Is that okay? Or do we approve of this? Is that part of our book of rules that we have here? You should know that Antioch and Jerusalem could not be any more different if you're thinking of two cities. Antioch was one of the largest cities in the Roman Empire, full of Gentiles, full of lots of idols, I'm sure, consumed in Greek culture. Jerusalem, on the other hand, was a deeply religious city. It still is a pretty religious city, right? Back then, it was a deeply religious place. In Jerusalem, you would find both the Jewish leadership and the Christian leadership, and they would want to maintain their traditions and practices. They would be very wary of the larger Greek culture and not want much of that in their city. They would want that. And so news of this creative, innovative group of Christians in Antioch, the sinful city of Antioch, would probably have caused concern for some of the leadership in Jerusalem. I'll keep reading. News of this reached the church in Jerusalem, and they sent Barnabas to Antioch. When he arrived, he saw what the grace of God had done, and he was glad. He was glad about it. He was encouraged. He encouraged them to remain true. Keep doing what you're doing. Remain true to the Lord with all their hearts. He was a good man, full of the Holy Spirit and faith, and a great number of people were brought to the Lord. So the church leadership in Jerusalem, they heard news, and it was so important to them, they had to send somebody over there. Now, we don't know exactly why they sent Barnabas there, the motivation, but there's probably mixed motivation. Some people might have been intrigued and interested and excited. I imagine some were not excited and sent Barnabas to investigate. This is often how this works. You know, here, if my district superintendent shows up unannounced to my church, I might be like, why is she here? You know, she hears something about me, you know? When the leadership shows up, you start to ask those questions, right? Why are they here? What is going on here? Barnabas may have been sent there to investigate these rebellious Christians who were doing this new thing in Antioch. Good thing about this, though, is Barnabas was a good man. You're not going to find anything negative about Barnabas in Acts. He's the guy earlier in Acts who sold a whole piece of property, and he gave all the money to the church. I mean, he's such a generous man. He supported Saul. When Saul was converted, Saul was the enemy of the church, and people didn't trust him when he was converted and gave his life to Jesus. Like, this ain't real. This guy's out to get us. He's just trying to trick us. But Barnabas was the guy who came in and said, no, I'm going to believe Saul. And he supported him. He vouched for him. And here we find Barnabas visiting this small creative community in Antioch. And when he arrived, what he saw that God was moving. He saw good fruit from their ministry. He saw this widely diverse group of people who have come together to reimagine what the future church could look like with both Jews and Gentiles. He didn't critique them. He couldn't critique them because he saw the Holy Spirit was moving among them. So he encouraged them. And he told them, keep up the fight. Keep up the good work. Keep your fire going. Don't let anybody tell you to stop doing this. And I love that it says Barnabas was glad. He had joy about what he saw. He wasn't jealous. He didn't go there and say, well, they're doing something cool and I'm not a part of it. He wasn't jealous about it. He didn't have any of those judgment or fear of a new thing. He was glad. He was joyful about the cool thing that was happening in Antioch. We'll read on. Then Barnabas went to Tarsus to look for Saul. And when he found him, he brought him to Antioch. And so for a whole year, Barnabas and Saul met with the church and taught great numbers of people. The disciples were called Christians first at Antioch. Now, I wonder if Barnabas saw what was happening in Antioch and thought, man, that guy Saul, who I've gotten to know, who gave his life to Jesus, he's so passionate and creative. He's willing to break some boundaries and break some rules. He's a good person to have here in Antioch. We need his creative energy, his passion. We need him to be a part of this new thing. And so Saul, who he goes by Saul and Paul, Saul was more the Jewish name, Paul was more among the Greeks, but Saul and Barnabas formed this partnership that ends up making this profound impact on the early church and really made an impact on us even today. This is so important. They spent a year together in Antioch, dreaming with these folks, working with them, creating new ways of thinking about God, theologizing, supporting, doing biblical study together, seeking to write this next chapter in the Jesus movement. 300 miles from Jerusalem, they were able to craft something new and something fresh, and they were able to reimagine Jesus for the broader world. And they helped so many people, including maybe all of us, definitely most of us in this room. We found our place in the story of Jesus because of this work. Because I imagine most of us are Gentiles in this room. Willie James Jennings describes Barnabas as a man of the in-between. He was a man who was willing to be in the tension. He was willing to cross boundaries. He was willing to reach beyond what was comfortable and allow his body to be a bridge between people, between communities. When Barnabas arrived in Antioch, he could have concluded that what they were doing was too much. He could have said, y'all need to tone this down. We're not ready for this yet. We haven't created rules for this yet. There's no protocol for how to bring the Gentiles in. Stop doing this. But no, he didn't do that. He could have concluded that it was too much, too radical, but he yielded to the Spirit. We need more of us who are willing to yield to the Spirit and allow his body to serve as a bridge between Jerusalem and Antioch, these two communities that couldn't have been more different. Jennings says, the holy work of drawing communities into shared life only happens through those willing to bear the space of the in-between in their bodies. It takes actual people that are going to be bridge builders and bring people together. I think we need that right now, right? We need more people like Barnabas, people of the in-between, more people willing to be bridge builders, bringing people together around the loving bond of Jesus that breaks down boundaries and tears down the walls that we build to separate. The church in Antioch was singing such a unique song by the way they lived that they finally received a name. They were first called Christians in Antioch. Now, most people believe this wasn't actually a title of honor, that they were called Christians as more of a way to ridicule them, to other them, to say that you are strange and different and we will label you and give you a name. And they embraced that name, and we're called Christians today. But this is always what happens to those willing to push us into the future. This is what happens to those who try to do something new. This is what happens to those who creatively try to follow their hearts and imagine a new world. They're almost always ridiculed and othered and dismissed. For most of us, like I said, if not all of us in this room, we find our roots of our faith in Antioch. This is where it started. Antioch, the center of the church actually, in actual notice, moves from Jerusalem to Antioch. And in many ways, it's because the Antioch Christians, these first folks, were willing to push the boundaries and try something new. As Gentiles, we find our place of belonging in this radical prophetic community in Antioch. I'll read on at the end of this section. During this time, some prophets came down from Jerusalem to Antioch. One of them, named Agabus, stood up and through the Spirit predicted that a severe famine would spread over the entire Roman world. This happened during the reign of Claudius. The disciples, as each one was able, decided to provide help for the brothers and sisters living in Judea, which is where Jerusalem was located. They did, sending their gift to the elders by Barnabas and Saul. This part of the story often gets skipped over and people don't focus on it, but it's really important. A prophet from Jerusalem came and visited these folks in Antioch, and he warned them of a severe famine that was going to hit them. This is what prophets do. They tell us the truth, even when it's hard news to hear. This small new community in Antioch, though, decided they were going to listen to the prophet. And they trusted the prophetic voice so much that they pulled their resources and they said, well, if there's a famine coming, we need to support our brothers and sisters in Judea and Jerusalem. These people who were very different than them, some of them who maybe didn't even want them in the church, they said, well, Jesus has called us to be generous, and so we're going to love them and support them and show solidarity with them. My guess is the Christians in Antioch maybe had more money. Often the Greeks had more money than the Jews. The Jews were a marginal group in this world. Maybe they had more resources. We don't know. But they thought that these Jews in Jerusalem needed to be helped. And maybe they were struggling and more marginalized. What a powerful witness this is. This new group of Gentile Christians listened to the prophets. They heard the dire warning, and they responded with compassion and justice. You know, the early church had a lot of flaws. The early church made a lot of mistakes. We sometimes glamorize the first Christians and say, if we could just be like them, everything would be great. They had a lot of drama, and we're going to talk about that as we go along in this series. However, I think the church in Antioch, what we find in these roots is so beautiful. It's so creative. It's so unique, so courageous. And my hope is Embrace can follow their lead, that we can be an Antioch type of church that's willing to push into the future. They have a lot to teach us, and I think we would be wise to pay attention. I have four series of questions to ask you. Some of them have more than one. But I want y'all to think about these as we go through. If you want to take a photo of them, you can. They'll be on the stream too. You can find them later, or I can give them to you. First one is, How should we break rank? And when I say break rank, you know, you don't go with what people tell you to do, you know. I don't like authority very much. I submit to it often, but sometimes I don't like to, you know. Sometimes we got to break rank with the authority and say we're going to do something because the Spirit has told us to, and we believe this is what Jesus would have us do. How can we break rank with the dominant way of things in order to witness to Jesus and His kingdom? There are many ways we might need to do this. And as we move forward in this world, like there's many ways we might have to think in your own employment how you might do that. How you might do that in kind of the dominant way things are structured in our world. As a white Christian, I have to think about this all the time. White supremacy is real in this world. How do I break rank with white supremacy and patriarchy in order to live in this world in a different way? And I fail many times, but I'm trying to do better. The second series of questions: how can we cultivate a similar creative energy as the Antioch church? How can we ignite our imagination to dream God's dream for our context today? I've talked a little bit about our context today before prayer. We're living in a very violent and difficult context right now. Very uncertain, very unsure, very divided, very filled with hate and suspicion and fear. How can we have a creative energy among us to ignite our imagination, to dream a different dream than our world is teaching us and showing us? It's going to take work. This is not something y'all will have the answer right now. But if you have ideas, please share. I know we have creatives in our church who have passion and dream dreams. Let's hear your dreams so that we can try to move forward together. Please set up a meeting with me. I want to talk. The third question, looking at Saul and Barnabas' relationship, how can we partner with others to sow seeds of Jesus' kingdom? Barnabas didn't want to do it alone. He's like, let's get Saul over here. And together, they made such an impact. Who do we need to partner with? Who do we bring on board? Who is someone that you want to reach out to and say, hey, I have this passion, I have this energy, I want to bring somebody on board, or a group of people, and let's work together to see what we can do. I've had to learn this over the years, and I've worked with Christina for 8.5 years now. She'll tell you this, but like early on, I used to just put my head down and try to do everything on my own. You know, that was kind of my way of things in the world. That's how I like to do stuff. I'm an independent, on my own kind of person. But I've learned that there's value, way more value, in bringing other people together and working with others. And I've become a much better person, I think, because of that. And then the fourth kind of series of questions, the last one. Who are the prophets among us alerting us to suffering and pain and tragedy? Are we listening? And how can we respond by sharing resources, thinking strategically, and showing solidarity? It's an important question. I was thinking about this earlier in the week, before even the events of yesterday, and this is stuff that I think is even more pertinent and serious as we see this escalation happening all around us. Who are we listening to? A friend of mine there was a really big thing that happened, and I saw him online trying to tell everybody to calm down. It's not a big deal, you know, and I'm just like thinking, I think it's a big deal, you know. And so be wary, you know, of the people who say, it's not a big deal, calm down, you know, because we're living in critical moments right now. And the prophets are the ones that are going to push us and challenge us. And we often, our natural instinct to prophetic voices is to close our ears and not listen because it makes us uncomfortable, because we don't like to hear the truth very often. But we got to lean in a little bit and try to listen to what the prophetic voices among us are saying. Now, not everybody's a prophetic voice. Some people just want to be a prophet online and say a lot of stuff. But there's ways to measure the fruit of that in community, and scriptures teach us how to do that, I think. But who are we paying attention to? Are we listening? I love the way they responded to Agabus, the prophet who visited them. They responded with compassion. They responded with solidarity with their suffering around them. And they responded with action, love in action. So these are some things I wanted to share with you all as we were going through this. Thank you for bearing with me as we broke down this text for this morning. This is a story I had not spent much time in, and it really, really spoke to me. And so hopefully some piece of it will speak to you this morning, and you can take something with you.